The air that morning was thick and unmoving, the kind that sits on your skin and makes every breath feel heavier than it should. Somewhere beyond the main house, a rooster crowed, sharp and impatient, cutting through the fog that still clung low to the ground. Dew soaked into the hems of long skirts as footsteps crossed the yard, slow, deliberate steps, not hurried, not unsure. This was not a morning of panic. This was a morning of decision. Imagine for a second what it's like to wake up knowing that whatever you choose today will echo long after you're gone, not just in whispers, not just in rumors, but in blood. Inside the house, the windows were open, but the air refused to move. Curtains hung limp. The smell of damp wood, candle wax, and last night's dying fire lingered in the rooms. A woman stood alone near the long dining table, her hands resting on its edge, fingers pressing into the polished surface as if she needed the solid feel of it to stay upright. She was a widow now, had been for nearly a year, and in 1847, being a widow didn't just mean grief, it meant vulnerability. It meant decisions no one prepared you for. It meant 5 daughters looking at you not just as their mother, but as the wall between them and a world that did not forgive weakness. You see, her husband had once been that wall. He had owned land, he had owned people, he had owned certainty. And then one winter, after a short illness no one spoke of in detail, he was simply gone. Buried under frozen soil while debts, expectations, and unspoken fears remained very much alive. Now the house was quieter, too quiet. No heavy boots on the porch, no voice calling for supper, just the sound of her daughters upstairs moving softly, already learning, without being told, to take up less space. And this is where the story usually begins, if it's told at all. A poor widow, 5 daughters, a failing plantation. But that's not the real beginning. The real beginning was standing out there in the yard, her eyes scanning the line of enslaved men waiting silently near the barn. They stood shoulder to shoulder, hats in their hands, eyes lowered, not because they didn't want to look up, but because experience had taught them when not to. These men had worked the land since before her youngest daughter was born. They had bled into the soil, buried family members in unmarked ground, learned how to read moods faster than words. And that morning, they knew something was different. Now this is where it gets strange. She wasn't there to punish anyone. She wasn't there to sell them, not yet. She was there to choose. Her gaze moved slowly along the line, not hurried, not uncertain. She wasn't looking at faces the way you might expect. She was measuring shoulders, height, the way backs stayed straight even after years of labor. She paused longer on some than others, her eyes narrowing slightly, thoughtful, calculating. Then she stopped. On him. He was the tallest of them all, by a head, maybe more. Long limbs, broad shoulders, skin darkened by sun and years of work, but his posture, there was something about it, something unbroken. Even as he stood there owned, measured, evaluated, he carried himself like a man who remembered being human. He didn't meet her eyes, he knew better, but he felt the weight of her stare settle on him like a hand. And she spoke, just once. Step forward. The sound of her voice was calm, almost gentle, but the men beside him stiffened anyway. He took a single step forward, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, heart pounding not with hope, but with fear, because being singled out never meant something good, not in this world. She studied him in silence, too long. Long enough for the tension to crawl up his spine and settle behind his eyes. "You," she said finally, "what's your name?" There was a pause, a breath, then quietly, "Elijah, ma'am." Elijah, a biblical name, a prophet's name, a name passed down by people who believed, even in chains, that words still mattered. She nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew. And then she said the words that would change not just his life, but the lives of her daughters, her grandchildren, and generations that hadn't even been imagined yet. You'll stay. That was all. No explanation, no reason given, just a command wrapped in finality. The others were dismissed. Boots shuffled, hats returned to heads, eyes flickered, some with relief, some with pity. Elijah remained where he was, unsure whether staying meant survival or something far worse. Inside the house, upstairs, 5 young girls pressed themselves near the banister, peeking through the rails, whispering to each other. They had been told to stay in their rooms. They hadn't listened. The oldest was 16, old enough to understand fear, old enough to understand power, old enough to sense that whatever their mother was doing down there had something to do with them. "Why him?" one whispered. No one answered, because none of them knew yet that their mother was about to make a decision born not from cruelty alone, but from terror. A decision shaped by a society that told her 5 unwed daughters were liabilities. A decision that would bind them forever to a man who, by law, had no right to refuse. And here's the question that hangs over this story like a storm cloud, the one you can't shake once you hear it. What kind of world forces a mother to look at another human being and see not a soul, but a solution? Because this wasn't about desire, and it wasn't about love. It was about legacy, survival, bloodlines, names that could not be allowed to disappear. And Elijah, standing there in the yard, silent, chosen, was about to be pulled into a plan so calculated, so disturbing, and so deeply human that even now, nearly 2 centuries later, it makes people look away when they hear it. But the real tragedy, this was not an unusual story. It was just one that was never supposed to be told. And what happened next is where the silence truly begins. Elijah didn't sleep much that night. The quarters were quieter than usual, but his mind wasn't. Every sound, the creak of wood, the distant cough of another man, the insects pressing their music into the dark, felt sharper, closer. He lay on his back, staring at the low ceiling, replaying the widow's voice again and again. You'll stay. Not why, not for how long, just stay. And in a place where nothing belonged to you, not even your own body, those words carried weight. You see, when you're enslaved, uncertainty is often worse than pain. Pain has edges. It starts, it peaks, it ends. But uncertainty stretches. It settles into your bones. It whispers possibilities you can't prepare for. Elijah had been whipped before. He'd been starved. He'd watched people sold away with barely enough time to say goodbye. But this felt like being moved into a room with the door closed behind you without being told what was going to happen inside. By morning, word had spread, quietly, carefully. No one said it outright, but eyes lingered on him longer. Women looked at him with something between sympathy and fear. Men avoided his gaze, not out of disrespect, but because they understood. Being chosen didn't mean favored, it meant exposed. When the sun finally climbed high enough to burn off the fog, he was summoned to the main house. That alone was enough to make his stomach tighten. The house always smelled different from the quarters, cleaner, heavier, like soap and polish trying to cover something old and sour underneath. Elijah stood just inside the doorway, hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the floorboards. He could see the widow's shoes, dark leather, worn at the toes. He could see the hem of her dress, neat and pressed. And then, slowly, she circled him, not like a predator, more like a buyer at a market. "Stand straight," she said. He did. She studied his shoulders, his arms, the length of his legs. She asked his age. He answered. She asked if he had ever been sick. He said no. She asked about his parents, where they'd come from, what they'd been like. That question almost broke him. My mother was tall, he said carefully. Strong. He paused. My father, too. She nodded, satisfied. Now imagine for a second what that feels like, to have your parents reduced to traits, height, strength, as if love, kindness, laughter, none of that mattered, just what could be passed on, just what could be used. She dismissed him with a wave of her hand. But she wasn't done. That evening, she gathered her daughters in the parlor. Lamps glowed softly, casting long shadows on the walls. The girls sat stiffly on the sofa, hands folded in their laps. They knew something was coming. Children always do. Their mother stood before them, spine straight, face composed. But if you looked closely, if you knew how, there were cracks, a tightness around her mouth, fingers pressing together a little too hard. You are no longer children, she began. The youngest flinched. This world, the widow continued, does not forgive women without protection. Your father is gone, and what remains of his estate will not last unless we are careful. The oldest daughter swallowed. Mama, what do you mean? There was a pause, a long one, the kind where truth hovers just outside the room, waiting to be invited in. I will not see you married off to men who see you as burdens, she said. I will not see our name disappear because we were too proud to do what was necessary. Necessary. That word has justified more horrors than almost any other. She told them then, not everything, but enough. There would be children. They would be born into the house. They would carry the family name. And the man chosen for this purpose would remain available. The room went silent. One daughter stared at the floor. Another shook her head slowly, as if she'd misheard. The youngest began to cry, not loud, just soft, confused sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. But he's, one of them whispered. Yes, the widow said sharply, he is enslaved, and that is precisely why this can be done. No one spoke after that. Because what could they say? That it was wrong? In a world built on wrong? That it was cruel? Cruelty was the air they breathed. That it was unnatural? Nothing about their lives was natural anymore. And this is the part people struggle with, the part where they want to simplify, to make the widow a monster and move on. But history isn't that kind. She was not a caricature. She was a woman backed into a corner by a system that rewarded brutality and punished hesitation. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it explains why she believed she had no other choice. Elijah learned the truth not from her, but from one of the house servants, a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the signs. She didn't say it outright. She didn't have to. Mind yourself, she whispered as she handed him a tray. You're being pulled into something you won't walk away from. That night he was told to wait in a small room off the main hall. Clean, sparse, a single chair, a bed that looked unused. The door closed behind him, and time stretched. He listened to footsteps, voices muffled by walls, a door opening, a pause, then another door closing. When the handle finally turned, it wasn't the widow who stepped inside. It was her eldest daughter. She stood there, pale, trembling, eyes fixed on a spot just past his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. Two people trapped by the same hand. One with power she never asked for, one with none at all. And in that silence, thick, suffocating, unbearable, you can almost hear the question echoing through history itself. Who survives, and at what cost? Because what happened in that room didn't just create children. It created a legacy of silence, shame, and survival so tangled that even generations later, no one knew where it truly began. And this was only the beginning. Because once the first boundary was crossed, there was no turning back. The first child was born just before winter set in, when the air turned sharp and the ground hardened like it was bracing itself for something it already knew was coming. Labor cries echoed through the house late into the night, muffled by thick walls that had absorbed generations of secrets. Candles burned low, hands moved quickly, water boiled, and outside, Elijah stood in the dark, staring at the windows, knowing without being told what was happening inside. No one asked him to be there. No one told him to leave. So he stayed. When the baby finally cried, sharp and alive, something inside him fractured. Not because of joy, not because of pride, but because sound made it real in a way silence never could. That sound carried weight. It carried consequences. A boy. They wrapped him in clean cloth and placed him in the widow's arms. She studied his face, searching for something. Herself, perhaps, or her late husband, or reassurance that what she had done had been worth it. "He has your height," one of the women murmured. The widow nodded. No one said Elijah's name. And that was the pattern, always. His presence was required, his humanity was not. The child was raised in the house, not the quarters. He learned to walk on polished floors. He learned to speak with proper grammar. He was taught to read, to write, to pray. He was given the family name. But there was a rule, an unspoken one. He was never to ask who his father was. Elijah watched him grow from a distance, close enough to see, far enough to be reminded of his place. Sometimes their eyes met, just for a second, a flicker of recognition neither of them could name. Then the boy would be ushered away. You see, children feel truth before they understand it. The second child came 2 years later, another boy, different daughter. Same silence. By then, the routine had hardened into something efficient, less hesitation, less discussion. The daughters did what was expected. The widow kept the house running. Elijah was summoned when needed, dismissed when done. No one asked him how it felt. And here's the thing that history often forgets. Survival doesn't always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like compliance so complete it erases you. Elijah learned to empty his face, to still his voice, to fold pieces of himself into places even he couldn't reach. That was the only way to endure. But the daughters, they changed too. The eldest grew sharp, controlled, distant. She rarely smiled. The second became withdrawn, spending long hours alone. Another grew angry, her temper flaring over small things, burning hot and fast. The youngest, still a child, watched everything with wide, frightened eyes, absorbing lessons no one ever taught her out loud. The house filled with children, boys and girls now, each one officially belonging, yet quietly set apart. Too dark to be unquestioned, too privileged to be punished like the others. They lived in the space between categories, where identity becomes a kind of wound. Neighbors noticed. They always do. Whispers followed the family at church. Eyes lingered on the children's faces. Someone once asked, jokingly, where the height came from. The widow laughed too loudly, changed the subject. But there was a problem she hadn't anticipated. The children grew, and the truth grew with them. One evening, as the oldest boy stood near the barn watching Elijah work, he asked the question no one had prepared an answer for. "Why do I look like you?" Elijah froze. This was the moment he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his head. And yet when it came, his mind went blank. The boy's eyes weren't accusing, they were searching, hungry for something solid to hold on to. "I don't know what you mean," Elijah said quietly. The lie tasted bitter, necessary, poisonous. The boy nodded slowly, but something shifted. From that day on, the questions came in other forms: lingering stares, unspoken defiance, a growing awareness that the rules applied differently to him. And the widow saw it too. Control began to slip. She tightened her grip, set stricter boundaries, limited interactions. She reminded everyone, constantly, of their place. But blood doesn't obey rules. As the daughters aged, marriages became an issue. Suitable matches were hard to find. Suitors hesitated. They saw the children. They did the math. Some daughters married anyway, quickly, quietly, to men who asked fewer questions. Others stayed, and the arrangement longed longer than it ever should have. By the time the widow fell ill, the house was crowded with people bound together with secrets so dense they felt physical. Children who knew they were connected but didn't know how. Adults who carried guilt like a second spine. On her deathbed, the widow called Elijah to her room. This was the first time she had ever asked him by name. She looked smaller now, fragile. The power she'd wielded for decades slipping through her fingers. "I did what I had to do," she whispered. Elijah said nothing. "You understand that. You must." He stood there silent, because understanding and forgiving are not the same thing. She died that night, and with her death, the structure holding everything together collapsed. Property was divided, papers were read, decisions were made. And suddenly questions that had been dangerous became unavoidable. Who belonged where? Who was free? Who had been used and who had benefited? Some children inherited land, others inherited confusion. Elijah inherited time, long overdue, and a life shaped by choices he never made. He left the plantation not long after, walked away with nothing but memory. But the bloodline she had tried so desperately to secure did not bring the safety she'd imagined. It brought fractures, estrangement, pain passed down like an heirloom no one wanted. And yet, some of those children survived, thrived even. They carried forward stories, fragmented, whispered, incomplete. Stories that would one day resurface in letters, in faded photographs, in DNA tests taken centuries later by people who felt something was missing and didn't know why. And this is where we have to stop and sit with the discomfort. Because this story isn't just about a widow in 1847. It's about what happens when a system teaches people that ownership is normal, that bodies are tools, that survival excuses everything. It's about the cost of building a future on someone else's silence. Elijah lived long enough to see freedom come, on paper at least. Whether it came inside him, that's harder to say. But if you listen closely, in the quiet moments between facts and dates, you can still hear it. The echo of footsteps on damp ground, a voice saying, "Step forward." A choice that rippled outward, touching lives that never consented to be part of it. And maybe that's the lesson history leaves us with. Not comfort, not closure, but a question. What do we owe the people whose suffering built the world we inherited? because some bloodlines are not legacies. They are warnings. After the widow was buried, the house felt hollow in a way no amount of furniture could fix. Rooms echoed, footsteps sounded louder. Even the children, now grown or half-grown, seemed to move more carefully, like they were afraid of waking something that might still be listening. Power has a strange way of lingering after death. For a while, nothing changed on paper. The plantation still stood, the fields were still worked, meals were still served at the same hours. But without her at the center, holding everything together through force of will alone, the truth began to leak out in small, uncontrollable ways. A glance held too long, a name spoken too softly, a question asked the wrong moment. One of the sons, nearly a man now, refused to attend church. When pressed, he snapped, "I'm tired of people looking at me like I don't belong anywhere." No one corrected him. No one could. Another daughter, married and living miles away, stopped writing home. When her husband finally explained why, his words were blunt and final. "Your family carries rumors. I won't have them attached to my children." That was the widow's greatest miscalculation. She believed control could outlive her, that silence could be inherited as easily as land. But silence needs a keeper. Elijah left quietly. No farewell, no announcement. One morning, he simply wasn't there. Some said he'd gone north. Others claimed he'd found work in a nearby town. A few whispered he'd reunited with people he thought he'd lost forever. The truth dissolved into speculation, the way it always does when the person who holds it has never been allowed to speak. Yet even gone, his presence remained. The children carried his face in their bones, his height in their spines. His eyes looked back at them from mirrors, from one another. They could run from him geographically, socially, legally, but not biologically. Years passed. The Civil War came like a storm that tore apart whatever illusions were left. Papers were burned, records disappeared, men left and didn't return. When emancipation finally arrived, it came unevenly, imperfectly, trailing confusion in its wake. Some of the widow's grandchildren were declared free by law and yet still trapped by circumstance. Others clung to whiteness like a lifeboat, denying any connection that threatened their place in the world. Families split. Cousins stopped speaking. Stories changed, depending on who was telling them. And this is the part that rarely makes it into textbooks. Freedom did not untangle the past. It exposed it. Decades later, a great-granddaughter would find an old letter tucked inside a Bible. No signature, just a few lines written in careful ink, a reference to the tall man and what was demanded of him. Enough to disturb, not enough to explain. She would spend years trying to understand why her family tree felt crooked, why certain names disappeared suddenly, why portraits vanished, why no one liked to talk about the plantation even though it was once the source of everything they had. And when she finally learned the truth, not all of it, never all of it, she didn't feel anger first, she felt grief. Grief for a man who never consented to fatherhood, yet left pieces of himself everywhere. Grief for women forced into choices framed as survival. Grief for children raised in a lie so complete it shaped their very sense of self. Because this story doesn't offer easy villains or comforting resolutions, it offers something harder. It shows us how ordinary people, afraid, constrained, desperate, can commit extraordinary harm while convincing themselves they are being practical, sensible, necessary. It reminds us that history is not just dates and laws and battles. It's bedrooms with doors that close softly. It's conversations that never happen. It's children who grow up knowing something is wrong but not having language for it. And maybe that's why stories like this matter. Not because they shock us, but because they ask us to sit with discomfort, to recognize that the past is not distant, it's intimate. It lives in our families, our systems, our assumptions. The widow believed she was securing a future. Elijah endured so others could survive. Their choices collided, and generations were born into the aftermath. So when we talk about resilience, we should be honest about what it costs. When we talk about legacy, we should ask who paid for it. And when we listen to history, we should lean closer to the quiet parts, because that's where the truth usually hides. Long after the plantation disappeared, after the land was sold and resold, after the house itself collapsed into memory, the bloodline continued, scattered, transformed, carrying both pain and perseverance. Not as a triumph, but as a reminder that humanity survives even when it is denied, and that some stories don't end with answers, they end with responsibility. To remember, to tell the truth, and to never again mistake silence for peace. Even now, if you walk that land, what's left of it anyway, you can feel it. The soil there holds memory differently. Farmers who came later would complain that nothing grew quite right in certain patches. Crops would wither for no clear reason. Trees leaned at odd angles, roots twisted like they were gripping something beneath the surface. Old people used to say the ground was tired, but tired doesn't begin to cover it. Long after Elijah was gone, long after the widow's name stopped meaning anything to anyone outside a few brittle documents, the descendants carried fragments of a story they couldn't quite place, a recurring dream, a sense of being watched, an unexplained shame that surfaced during family gatherings when certain topics came too close to something forbidden. One man, 3 generations removed, would later say that growing up, he always felt like his family history had been edited, like someone had taken a knife to it and cut out the parts that explained everything. You could feel the gaps, he said, like missing teeth you keep touching with your tongue. And that's how trauma works. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hums quietly in the background, shaping choices, relationships, fears you can't trace to any single moment. Some descendants tried to outrun it. They moved west, changed names, married into families that asked fewer questions. They leaned hard into respectability, into church, into appearing uncomplicated. Others went the opposite direction, angry, defiant, pushing against rules they couldn't explain but instinctively resented. A few went looking. Those were the ones who dug through archives, who spent hours squinting at census records where ages didn't line up and racial categories shifted inexplicably from one decade to the next. They noticed how one child was listed as white in one document, mulatto in another, black in a third. Ink tried to pin them down, blood refused. And sometimes, this part matters, they found Elijah's name. Not much, a work record here, a bill of sale there, a single line in a ledger reduced to a number and a value. But once you see a name, you can't unsee it. One woman, well into her 60s when she finally put the pieces together, sat at her kitchen table for hours afterwards, just sitting, not crying, not angry, just still. "I keep thinking about his silence," she said later. "How many times he must have wanted to speak and couldn't." That's the inheritance no one prepares you for. Not land, not money, but unanswered questions that rearrange your sense of self. And here's something else history rarely admits. Not everyone involved believed they were doing wrong. The widow told herself she was protecting her daughters. The daughters told themselves they were surviving. The community told itself it was none of their business. But harm doesn't require malice to be real. Elijah never wrote his story down. If he had thoughts about the children who carried his blood but not his name, they were never preserved. If he felt love, grief, rage, resignation, those emotions lived and died inside him. And maybe that's why this story hurts so much, because the man at its center never got to narrate it. So we're left piecing together his life from the consequences of other people's choices, from the echoes, from the way his absence shaped everything that followed. Imagine for a moment what it means to be forced into fatherhood without the right to claim it, to see pieces of yourself walking around in the world calling someone else father, living lives you will never touch. Imagine what it costs to endure that quietly. This isn't a story about villains and heroes. It's a story about systems that corner people until every option feels wrong. About how power distorts morality. About how survival, when filtered through injustice, can turn into something unrecognizable. And it's about responsibility. Not guilt for what we didn't personally do, but responsibility for what we choose to remember, to acknowledge, to confront. Because the past doesn't ask to be forgiven. It asks to be told honestly. So when we speak Elijah's name now, when we let it sit in the air, full and human, we're doing something small but necessary. We're refusing to let him remain a shadow. We're recognizing that history is made not just by those who write it, but by those who endure it. And maybe that's the quiet hope buried inside this story, that even after centuries of silence, truth can still surface. Not to reopen wounds, but to finally let them breathe. Because healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from seeing clearly and choosing, now, with the benefit of distance and awareness, to do better than those who came before us. That's how the story ends. Not with resolution, but with a reckoning. And an invitation to listen more closely next time history whispers. There's a temptation when a story reaches this point to stop, to let reflection stand in for resolution. But real lives don't fade out so neatly, and neither does this one. Because even after the truth begins to surface, after names are spoken, after records are found, the consequences keep unfolding in quiet, ordinary ways. One descendant learned the story through a DNA test taken on a whim. No expectations, just curiosity. When the results came back, they didn't make sense at first. Percentages that shouldn't have been there, regions that didn't align with family lore. So she started asking questions. At first, people laughed it off. Those tests aren't exact. Then came the discomfort, then the defensiveness, then the silence. Eventually, an aunt pulled her aside at a reunion and said, barely above a whisper, "Some things are better left alone." But that sentence didn't land the way it once might have, not anymore, because the world had changed just enough for curiosity to be safer than silence, for questions to feel less like threats and more like necessities. So she kept digging, and what she uncovered wasn't just Elijah, it was the ripple effect of his erasure. Children raised to deny parts of themselves, families trained to edit photographs, to crop out faces that didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. Generations taught, implicitly, that belonging was conditional. She found a pattern. Whenever a descendant leaned too far into truth, they were quietly pushed away. Not cut off dramatically, just distanced. Invitations slowed. Calls went unanswered. The message was clear without ever being stated. Don't disrupt the narrative. That's how power survives. Not always through force, but through discomfort. And yet, for every door that closed, another cracked open. Distant cousins reached out, shared fragments, compared notes. Slowly, cautiously, a fuller picture began to form, not just of Elijah, but of everyone shaped by what was done to him. One man admitted he'd always felt like he was pretending to be someone else in certain spaces and never understood why. Another said she'd grown up terrified of being found out, though she couldn't explain what that meant. They were all carrying the same inheritance, and something remarkable happened when they finally named it. The shame began to loosen. Not disappear, but loosen, enough to breathe. Because shame thrives in isolation. It weakens when shared. That's the quiet power of telling these stories out loud, not to accuse the living of the sins of the dead, but to understand how the past scripts the present unless we actively revise it. Elijah never got to choose his role in this history, but the people who came after him, they get to choose what they do with it. Some have chosen to honor him in small ways, naming children after him, visiting the land where he once stood and speaking his name into the open air, writing him into family histories where he was once deliberately omitted. Others have chosen something just as meaningful: honesty, saying plainly, this is where we come from, all of it. And that honesty changes things. It reframes resilience not as silence, but as survival with memory intact. It reframes legacy not as purity, but as complexity. Because the truth is, the widow didn't create a new bloodline the way she imagined. Bloodlines already existed. She only tried to control them. And control, especially over human lives, always leaves damage in its wake. What endured wasn't her plan. What endured was Elijah's humanity carried forward in ways no one could fully suppress. So when we tell this story now, we're not just recounting something dark and distant, we're participating in a larger act of repair. We're choosing to see enslaved people not as background figures, not as footnotes, but as central, thinking, feeling, enduring human beings whose lives mattered then and matter now. And maybe that's the deepest lesson buried here, that history isn't fixed. It's alive, reshaped every time we choose to look at it honestly. Every time we refuse to accept a polished version that excludes suffering. Every time we say a name that was meant to be forgotten. Elijah. Say it again. Let it settle. Because remembering him doesn't undo what was done, but it does something just as important. It restores dignity where there was denial. And in a world still wrestling with the legacies of ownership, control, and silence, that act, quiet, deliberate, human, might be the most powerful thing we can do. There's one last thing that rarely gets said out loud when stories like this are told. Something uncomfortable, something that doesn't fit neatly into moral lessons or closing reflections. Healing is not linear. For some descendants, learning the truth didn't feel like release. It felt like rupture, like the ground shifting under their feet all over again. One man described it as realizing the house you grew up in had been built over a sinkhole. Everything looked solid until it wasn't. I didn't know who I was allowed to be anymore, he said. I didn't know which side of the story I belonged to. That confusion makes sense because this story refuses to stay on one side. It doesn't let anyone claim purity. It doesn't offer the comfort of distance. The widow was not a stranger. Elijah was not an abstraction. The daughters were not symbols. They were people whose decisions and silences braided together into something that outlived all of them. And that's what makes this history so hard to carry. Some descendants tried to turn it into something redemptive too quickly. They wanted a lesson that felt clean, something like out of suffering came strength, and while that's not untrue, it can also become a way to skip over the pain that made that strength necessary in the first place. Others resisted any framing that sounded like forgiveness. They didn't want to soften what had happened. They wanted to sit in the anger, to let it have weight. Both reactions are valid, because the truth doesn't ask us to feel one way about it. It asks us to stay present with it. And presence is harder than judgment. One descendant, a school teacher, eventually decided to tell the story to her students, not as family lore, but as history. She spoke about systems, about power, about how easily human beings can be reduced to functions when laws allow it. She never named the plantation, never named the widow, but she named Elijah. After class one day, a student stayed behind and asked, "Why didn't he run?" She paused before answering. "Because sometimes," she said slowly, "survival doesn't look like escape. Sometimes it looks like enduring something you should never have had to endure." That answer stayed with her. It stayed with the student, too, because it pushes against a narrative we're taught to love, the idea that freedom is always a matter of courage, that resistance is always visible, that the oppressed are responsible for saving themselves. Elijah resisted in the only way he could, by surviving without becoming what the system demanded he be, less than human. And that kind of resistance rarely makes headlines. It lives in the quiet choice to keep breathing, to not disappear, to leave traces of yourself in a world trying to erase you. Years from now, someone else will stumble onto this story, maybe through a document, maybe through a test, maybe through a question that won't let them sleep. And when they do, they'll feel that familiar mix of disbelief and recognition, that sense that history is not as distant as it pretends to be. They'll see themselves reflected in it, not just as beneficiaries or victims, but as inheritors. And inheriting history means inheriting responsibility. Not to punish the past, but to refuse to repeat its silences. So if this story leaves you unsettled, that's not a flaw, that's the point. It's meant to sit with you, to linger, to make you think about the stories that were never told in your own family. The gaps you've felt, but maybe never named. Because somewhere, in those gaps, there are names waiting to be spoken, lives waiting to be acknowledged. And maybe, if we listen closely enough, if we resist the urge to rush past discomfort, we can finally hear them, not asking for pity, not asking for absolution, just asking to be remembered. And that, in the end, is how this story continues, not on paper, but in the choices we make now, with eyes open, voices steady, and a willingness to tell the truth, even when it's heavy. Especially when it's heavy. There's a quiet moment that often comes after a story like this, when the words stop but your mind doesn't, when you realize you've been holding your breath without noticing. That pause matters, because it mirrors the pause that stretched across generations, the waiting, the unsaid, the suspended truth. And in that pause, something else emerges: empathy. Not the shallow kind that lets us say, "That was terrible," and move on, but the deeper kind that asks, "What would I have done if I had been there?" Not as a hero, not as a monster, but as an ordinary human shaped by fear, law, expectation, and survival. That question is dangerous. It strips away comfort. Because the widow wasn't born cruel, she was shaped. The daughters weren't born complicit, they were cornered. And Elijah wasn't born silent. Silence was forced on him until it became armor. History likes clean lines: victim, villain, savior. But real lives blur those lines until they're almost useless. One descendant said something once that captured it perfectly. "I kept looking for someone to blame so I wouldn't have to feel connected." That's the trap. Connection is harder than condemnation, because connection means acknowledging that the systems which made this possible didn't vanish. They evolved. They learned new language, new rules, new disguises. But at their core, they still trade in the same currency: power over bodies, over futures, over who gets to belong. And that's why this story still matters, not because it's shocking, but because it's familiar in ways we don't always want to admit. We still live in a world where some people's choices are framed as necessary, while others are never given a choice at all, where legacy is protected more fiercely than truth, where silence is rewarded as maturity. Elijah's life exposes that lie, because silence didn't protect him, it protected everyone else. And yet, this is important, his life was not only defined by what was taken from him, it was also defined by what endured. His name survived, his blood survived, his humanity survived, carried forward imperfectly, painfully, but undeniably. That endurance doesn't justify what happened, but it does remind us that oppression never fully succeeds. It can wound, it can scar, it can shape generations, but it cannot erase the fact that the people it targets are human, complex, resilient, unforgettable. So when we sit with this story, we're not being asked to feel resolved. We're being asked to feel responsible. Responsible for how we tell history. Responsible for whose voices we amplify. Responsible for whether we accept comfortable versions of the past or insist on honest ones. Because stories like this don't just belong to archives, they belong to conversations at dinner tables, to classrooms, to moments when someone says, "That's not how I learned it," and we choose to lean in or look away. The widow's plan failed in the way all plans built on dehumanization eventually fail. It didn't secure peace. It didn't erase difference. It didn't protect anyone from consequence. What it did do was leave behind a legacy that demanded to be confronted. And confronting it, fully, honestly, is where something new becomes possible. Not redemption, not closure, but awareness. And awareness, when paired with compassion and accountability, can change how we move forward. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this. History is not finished with us. It is still asking questions, still waiting to see whether we will repeat its patterns or finally recognize them. And maybe the most powerful way to honor Elijah and all those like him is not just to remember what was done to them, but to pay attention to how easily it could happen again if we stop listening. There is another layer to this story that only reveals itself when you stop asking what happened back then and start asking why it stayed hidden for so long. Because events don't disappear on their own. They're pushed, covered, reframed, sometimes even dressed up as tradition or the way things were. And that hiding takes effort. For decades after the war, after emancipation, after the land changed hands, there were still people invested in keeping the story quiet. Not because they were personally guilty, but because acknowledging it threatened the fragile architecture of identity they'd built their lives on. Think about that for a moment. How many families survive by telling themselves a simpler version of their past? How many inherit comfort because someone, somewhere, decided silence was easier than truth? One descendant admitted something years later that startled even her. She said, "I think part of me always knew. I just didn't want to be the one who made it real." That's a heavy thing to carry. Knowing that truth has a cost and that you might be the one expected to pay it. Because when you speak these stories aloud, you don't just change how you see the past, you change how people see you. You disrupt the unspoken agreements that keep families intact, even when those agreements are built on omission. Some relatives accused her of betrayal. "Why dig this up now?" they asked. "What good does it do?" But that question misunderstands something fundamental. Truth isn't excavated because it's useful, it's excavated because it's there. And because leaving it buried doesn't make it harmless, it just makes it powerful in ways you can't see. The longer this story stayed hidden, the more it shaped behavior without explanation. Why certain children were praised for being quiet. Why ambition was encouraged in some and discouraged in others. Why marrying well was treated as salvation. Why anger was feared more than injustice. Those patterns didn't come from nowhere. They came from a house where survival once depended on obedience, from a legacy where love and violence occupied the same rooms, from a man whose body was treated as a resource and whose silence became a model. And yet, even with all of that, there were moments of defiance woven quietly into the lineage. A granddaughter who refused to lie to her own children. A son who married someone his family disapproved of and never apologized. A great-grandson who chose a profession centered on justice without fully knowing why it mattered so much to him. Resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like choosing honesty where silence once ruled. Elijah never stood before a crowd and declared his humanity. He was never granted that stage. But his existence itself was an argument. His survival was a refusal. His descendants, living, questioning, remembering, are evidence that even the most calculated systems of control leave behind something they can't manage. Truth. Messy, inconvenient, persistent. And maybe that's why this story feels unfinished, because in many ways it is. Not because we lack an ending, but because endings aren't the point. The point is what we do after listening. Do we rush to distance ourselves, telling ourselves, that was then? Or do we sit with the harder realization that history is not a closed book, but a living draft revised by what we choose to acknowledge? The widow made her choice in fear. The daughters lived with its consequences. Elijah bore its weight. And we, here, now, inherit the responsibility of deciding whether their story is reduced to a curiosity or allowed to inform how we understand power, consent, survival, and dignity. Because remembering Elijah isn't just about honoring the past, it's about sharpening our moral vision in the present, about recognizing when necessary becomes an excuse, about noticing whose bodies are still being treated as means rather than ends, and about refusing the comfort of silence when silence only serves those already protected by it. This story doesn't ask you to carry guilt. It asks you to carry awareness, and to let that awareness change the way you listen, the way you question, the way you tell stories, especially the difficult ones. Because somewhere, in the space between what was done and what is remembered, there is a choice being made again and again, to forget or to tell the truth. And every time this story is told, fully, honestly, without rushing past its discomfort, that choice leans a little closer towards justice. And so we come to the end, the way all honest stories end, not with a full stop, but with a quiet reckoning. Because nothing about this story resolves cleanly. It shouldn't. Lives shaped by coercion, silence, and survival don't tie themselves into neat conclusions. They linger. They ask to be carried forward with care. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost return to where we began, the heavy air of that early morning, the sound of footsteps on damp ground, a woman standing on the edge of a decision she would justify for the rest of her life, a man stepping forward because he was told to, because he had no other choice. That moment didn't end in 1847. It stretched outward, touching daughters, sons, grandchildren, strangers who would one day search for answers without knowing exactly what they were looking for. It shaped silences at dinner tables. It shaped fears people couldn't name. It shaped resilience that never asked to be tested. And still, life went on. Children laughed, people loved, families formed and fractured and reformed again. Humanity persisted even when it was denied, especially when it was denied. That's the part worth holding on to. Not as redemption, not as consolation, but as truth. Elijah was not just what was done to him. He was a man who endured, a man whose existence disrupted the lie that ownership could ever erase humanity. A man whose legacy survived not because it was planned, but because it was human. And the widow? She is a reminder of how fear, when paired with power, can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary harm while believing they are being practical, sensible, responsible. History is full of such moments, which is why remembering matters. Not to reopen wounds, but to prevent their repetition. Not to assign inherited guilt, but to inherit awareness. Not to look away when stories get uncomfortable, but to lean in, knowing that discomfort is often where truth lives. So when you leave this story, don't rush to forget it. Let it sit with you. Let it trouble you just enough to sharpen your attention to the world around you, to the ways power still moves quietly, to whose voices are still missing, to whose bodies are still treated as means rather than lives. Because the past is not asking us to fix it, it's asking us to listen. And in listening, really listening, we do something profoundly human. We refuse silence. We choose memory. And we make space for dignity where it was once denied. That is where this story ends. Not in peace, but in truth.